One woman said afterwards, she said, Brenda, when you shared your story, it gave all of us the permission to be real. And I think that's what vulnerability does for other people when any of us open a space to be vulnerable.
This is worth it. I'm going to be real. It's scary. And there have been hurtful times. The good times far outweigh the hurtful times and the healing that came through all of those things. Welcome to the Midlife Moms podcast. We're so glad you've joined us today for episode 6. We are talking about vulnerability. My name's Amelia Rhodes. I'm your host today, and joining me today is our co-host, Brenda Yoder. Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning.
Well, we usually start each episode with a laughing matter. And last time we can laugh because we forgot. We totally were so excited to talk about friendship. We forgot our laughing matter. So this time, Brenda, because laughter is so important in this phase of life, what's got you laughing this week?
So this week, I was kneeling on the floor. I was kneeling on the floor beside a student, a 5th grade student at the school where I work. And I was actually doing kind of an intervention with him. I was whispering to him really important things for self-efficacy, to help him to get some work done. And then after I gave my little pep talk, I couldn't get up off the floor. So I have a torn ACL in one of my knees. And so here I was like, I had to laugh at him. I just given him this like big, long pep talk about important things in life. And then I was like, okay, I can't get up off the floor.
Isn't that just a picture of midlife? We're handling big, important things and then have to laugh because you can't get off the floor.
Right.
That's just a picture of it. Well, for me, I went to the grocery store with my husband a week ago or so, and I saw this little bottle. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'll show you this little bottle of apple cider vinegar. And you can see it's empty. And so it was this little brand, and it said that it was turmeric and honey apple cider vinegar. Well, midlife, you start thinking about your health. My husband loves to do apple cider vinegar drinks, or like a shot. He'll just drink it straight, a little in a fancy little cup, a shot of apple cider vinegar. And so I thought, well, this might be one that I would actually like, turmeric and honey. So I bought it, paid way too much for this little bottle, but it was really good. And so we each have our fancy little cups where we pour our little shot of apple cider vinegar. And my daughter comes down, she's 16. And here we are, like sputtering in the kitchen, like laughing, sputtering, get tears coming out of our eyes. It's so good. But we're like standing there coughing, but commenting how good it is. And she's like, what is wrong with you? So then we poured her a shot of apple cider vinegar, and she did the exact same thing. She's sputtering, laughing. It's so good, but wow. So that's, having fun in the kitchen with a shot of apple cider vinegar.
Because you're midlife and you have to take shots of those things. Like that's the real thing. I have some too that I bought, but it's sitting in the back of my refrigerator next to, I think, the cranberry concentrate. Like that's supposed to be this really healthful drink too, but obviously I have not pulled them out for a while. But
so I find it's more fun if you have a fancy cup for your little shot. So well, we're so glad that you've all joined us today, and we're going to dig into this topic of vulnerability, which, before you turn it off, stick with us. I know that this can be a frightening topic, one that we may not want to dig into. We talked about it a little bit in our previous episode on friendship, but it is so important to find safe and healthy places to be vulnerable in appropriate ways. And I think it can make a huge difference in our lives in general, but especially in this midlife season.
Yeah. And I think that some people have more of a natural bent to be vulnerable. I'm one of those people. I've had to learn how to not wear my emotions on my sleeve. I've had to learn, unfortunately, probably the hard way of who's safe to share with, how much to share. That's been a journey over my life. But I know for you, Amelia, that vulnerability actually presented in your life through anxiety. Do you want to share a little bit about your story?
Yeah, and I was the opposite. I am not a naturally vulnerable person. I'm the one who my whole life, I was there for you if you needed it, but I was good. I didn't need anyone's help, and really lived this life of perfectionism and performance from a very young age on. And it probably really presented in middle school, which is when I started to battle anxiety. And that shaped my teenage, young adult, early adulthood years. And I didn't even realize it. It had become such a protective coat of armor, such a part of my identity, that I had truly believed I was just doing my best. This was who I was. This was even what God expected of me, to have it all together, and never shared with anyone. Maybe my mom knew that I was having panic attacks in high school, maybe, but nobody knew. And I just had stuffed it for so long. Went to counseling in college for the first time to really start to work through it. And this was mid 90s. We didn't know as much as we know about mental health. And I shut even the counselor out. Like when she's asking what's wrong, I'm like, well, nothing's wrong, which was true. You would look at my life and think everything was fine, but it was this deep down battle. And so I shared about it in my book, Isn't It Time for a Coffee Break? Which, had you told me at 25, I would be sharing about panic attacks and anxiety, and that God would call me to be open about that, I never would have believed you. But it was in my early 30s with 2 young kids, a conversation with a doctor that led to medication, that led to counseling. And then eventually, and that really was the order of things, a conversation with a doctor was the first place I was completely vulnerable and real with what I was really going through. That led to medication, and then a counselor, and then talking to 2 friends. And I will never forget the fear and terror of picking up that phone call to tell that first friend what I was really battling with. And the only reason I did was because she was a pharmacist. And my husband was like, just maybe start with her. He had started to see the cracks and the signs. And he said, why don't you call and talk to her about the prescription? And of course, she knows what it's for, and was like, Amelia, what's going on? And I remember that moment of taking a deep breath of, am I going to be real? Am I going to brush it under the rug? And I was so tired and so exhausted that what do I have to lose? Like, I'm miserable. And I shared the whole story of my continual panic attacks, not sleeping, insomnia, the fear, all of it. And she listened. And when she responded, she was like, Amelia, I never would have known, never would have guessed. And that would have been the case for most everyone in my life, including maybe even my husband. And that was a defining moment for me that completely shaped my adulthood. And it was kind of the cord that snipped. It's like, okay, this is worth it. I'm going to be real. It's scary. And there have been hurtful times, but the hurtful times, the good times far outweigh the hurtful times, and the healing that came through all of those things. And I think that's what we'll talk about too, Brenda. You've mentioned, through all of those things, for me, it was a conversation with a doctor, it was a counselor, and then eventually friends. And I know for you, Brenda, that your struggle with vulnerability took on a different shape and form for you.
Yeah, being vulnerable and sharing emotions has always come naturally to me. I think growing up, I grew up in a very expressive household, so we were talking all the time. So I've never really had a problem about talking what I'm thinking about or what I'm feeling. But what I found was, as my kids got older, and I started teaching, my husband and I live in a small community where everyone kind of knows everything that's going on, with everyone else. And we were both school teachers, and it was kind of like our family was a fishbowl. So oftentimes you talk about how being a pastor's kid or a pastor's family, you're in a fishbowl. Well, in our community, with both of us being teachers, we really had touching points with almost everyone in our community. So we kind of felt like we were in a fishbowl. And um, I too kind of lived a life that everything was good. Like everything was good, everything was perfect. We were busy, we were involved, but at the same time, I was falling apart. I was really struggling with my own stress, not so much anxiety, but just stress, and struggling with anger and being a reactionary parent. And so as life was so filled with stress, I had no breathing room. Working full time, teaching 180 kids all day, having 4 kids of my own, from teenagers down to elementary kids. And I started having a lot of conflict within my home because I was reactionary. And I got to the point where I was reaching out to people. So you kind of reach out sometimes, in being vulnerable, you test things out, right? You kind of push those push those, kind of knock on the doors to see who's safe, to see who's
Right.
open and if they're safe or not. And in my knocking on the doors to see who was safe to talk about my struggles as a mom who felt like my family was falling apart, I was falling apart, I didn't find safe places. And that was really hard for me. What I really needed was someone who would open the door and let me share what I was struggling with without judgment or shame, or with honest, authentic encouragement. And the few places where I kind of knocked on the door and shared a little bit, there there was wasn't necessarily something negative came, but there weren't words. Like it was almost like someone didn't know what to do with the fact that I was struggling. And so um, I, through a series of events, I started blogging. Kind of, this was back in the early 2010, probably around 2010, just kind of wondering when blogging was first out there, is there anyone out there in this big wide world of darkness who is struggling, who's kind of lived the Christian formula, but um, is struggling? And I found that there were other people. There were a lot of other moms and Christian women who were struggling, but didn't find safe spaces. And one time in my small community, someone came up to me in a grocery store behind me and said, Brenda, I read your blog and it really ministers to me. And I kind of freaked out because I was like, oh no, no one local is supposed to read what I write. But what I found in my blog, which is Life Beyond the Picket Fence, is that women truly hunger and thirst for safe spaces. And for myself, writing and then knowing that other people were struggling then opened up the door for me to have confidence in being vulnerable, um, not only through that forum of writing, but then also more vulnerable in relationships. Because what I realized was once I was kind of on the other side, I just made a commitment that I was going to be a safe person to people, whether in person or online, who need a safe place, a safe person to talk to when their life is kind of falling apart.
That's so important. And I have found the same thing, that once I came through this on the other side, I shared with one friend and then two, and found over time, did some work of some healing. I wanted to do that as well. And whenever I speak and share my story and my testimony, which has a lot to do with anxiety and panic, I couldn't believe how many women of all ages come up and speak with me after and say, that's my story. I remember talking to an 80-year-old woman who was like, that's my story. I don't really talk about it with anyone. And my heart just breaking for her that she hadn't had safe places through her whole life to be able to share these kinds of things and be vulnerable. And so often women will come, and being a safe place, because I've shared mine, they will come and speak with me after and then tell me, you're the first person I've told. And so what I always encourage them, I'm like, I'm so proud of you. You've taken the first step. Now, who is in your community or who is in your life that you can go take that second step with? Who do you have a relationship with or can build a relationship with that you can take that second step of starting to be vulnerable with? Because it's so important to have that in relationship, someone who will journey with you through that. And that may look different depending on what it is you're struggling with, right, Brenda?
Yeah, for sure. Because like your struggle was with anxiety. Mine was with anger. And and I know for myself that um church was not the place, not necessarily my church in particular, but kind of the Christian community. Vulnerability is something that is a space that we enter into, but we have to have this environment where there's not going to be judgment or shame. And
Mm-hmm.
I think when we put on the everything's fine, everything is good in a lot of different environments, then it prevents that safe space for someone to say, hey, even though most things are going okay in my life, I'm struggling with this, or this thing is happening in my life, whether it's because of my own sin or the sin of someone else or just life in general. And I don't know how to handle it. I think part of that vulnerability is that element, especially as women, to admit that we don't know how to handle something, and that part of needing help. Um, One thing is, I was just thinking about listening to your story and thinking about when I've shared my story. I give a particular testimony that I only share in closed spaces, and I call it my angry mom story. But one woman said afterwards, she said, Brenda, when you shared your story, it gave all of us the permission to be real. And I think that's what vulnerability does for other people when any of us open a space to be vulnerable. And so in relationships, Amelia, what have you found? Not everyone's going to share their testimony or be speakers like you and I,
Right.
or write it on a page or on a blog, but in our own relationships, how do we get over the risk of being vulnerable when there really is a lot of shame there? There's a lot of fear.
Mhm.
What have you found has been helpful to kind of bridge that gap of the risk of being vulnerable?
That's a good question. And it's tough, I think, depending on where you are. I'm leading a small group so we can be part of creating safe spaces, right? So this year I'm leading a small group, and we came to a topic that was really tough and we knew could be one filled with shame and burden. And so we just kind of put it on the table. I think finding people where you can, like, we may not agree on this, but like there's no shame here. And that's what we said. We're just going to put it on the table tonight. There is no judgment. There is no shame. Wherever you're coming from, we're here to love and encourage each other. And so sometimes it's kind of testing those waters of, maybe in a small way, what's something I can share and what's the reaction, testing that water of, are you a safe person? And then maybe even having an honest conversation. If I'm really struggling with something, and I don't know what to do with it. And so kind of testing the water in safe places with maybe a small group of friends, one friend. So for me, it started with someone who was a medical background,
Mm-hmm.
someone who had a medical background in what I was dealing with, and just kind of testing the water. And then she opened that door. What's really going on? So do you have tips too that you have seen? It's hard. It's a little bit of trial and error. And we will talk in a future episode about forgiveness and betrayal and trust, because that is a whole topic in itself as well.
Yeah, I think that I think getting so I- as I'm thinking through this, I guess my gut reaction is being vulnerable with God first.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we tend to go to people because they're human and they're going to meet those needs for us. But for myself, in my searching for that person, where was a safe place for me to be vulnerable? I didn't really find it when I needed it. It actually came out of came out of a really dark season. But what I did find is that vulnerability with God is even something that we have to understand is part of our walk with Him. And, in the last episode, I wrote about an element where I was writing in my journal to God, where I said, I don't have any friends. And then I started crying. And that that was one of those spaces of vulnerability with God, to really be able to say, this truly is how I'm feeling, and it's something I'm really struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
And it opened the door of this. Being vulnerable really is saying that I'm needy.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a hard time saying we're needy. In fact, I was just talking with someone the other day. Something that I had found recently is hard for me to say or receive are the words "you're welcome," because the words "you're welcome," if if I if someone says, "Hey, thank you," it's easy to say "you bet" or "of course," because it's more of a like, "Oh, well, sure, of course we would do that for each other." But when someone says "you're welcome," it's almost an acknowledgement that there was something that was needed
Mm-hmm.
and that you received. And so I've been really processing those words, "you're welcome." Um, and so bringing that back to getting over the risk is that sometimes it can be something as small as saying "you're welcome," or
Right.
saying thank you for something, because that acknowledges a point of need. And vulnerability really is about sharing your needs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know for myself that when I often ask, whether it's a client or a group that I'm speaking to, for women to share their needs, women are caught off guard because we're not really taught to think about our needs. But vulnerability really is at this point, whether it's emotional or physical or spiritual,
Mhm.
to be able to say, I have a need and I don't know how to get that need met.
And there's an element of modeling this for our kids. We had a situation, big situation, about a decade ago where my husband was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And there came a point where we're like, we have to tell people there's going to be surgery, there might be treatment. We need to let people into this. And our family stepped in, and my parents were staying with us. And my husband's like, well, we don't really need meals. And I had friends who wanted to bring some meals. And I remember that moment where I said, no, we need to let friends bring meals. We need to let them in to help, because that also models that for our kids, that when you're in a hard time, when you're going through something, you let people step in to help. And that was a turning point for us. And my kids will still talk about those meals. Here we are a decade later that our friends brought. In fact, they remember it as, your friends are really good cooks. Somebody needs to get sick more often. So it couldn't be something as simple as accepting a gift, accepting a meal, or letting someone know that you need a little bit of help. Now,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just to say, sometimes there are bigger things that maybe a community isn't equipped or trained to know how to help you. And we talked about, friendships help in our last episode. So, Brenda, how would you say when it's at that point that someone needs to talk to a doctor or talk to a counselor or maybe get a formal mentoring? Because there is this fear of like, I don't want to just dump on my friends and then, they don't know what to do and they walk away. That's a very real thing. But there are times that we need to start with maybe some trained help.
Yeah. So as a licensed counselor, this is a really good question because I don't counsel my friends and yet I give counsel to my friends. So I'll just really walk through with you what has literally happened a couple of different times with friends who, as they were, we're being vulnerable with each other. And these are friends who I do have that relationship with. And um, so eventually you get to the point where you say, hey, maybe you need to talk with others other than me about this, who have those resources to help you. So in one particular instance that I was thinking, I said, hey, maybe I think it's time for you to share this with your family because they really need to be aware of what's going on. And then, there comes a time where you have to say to a friend, this is more than what I can do. Because so as a person who's actually trained to do the help, I'm also emotionally invested in these relationships with people that I love. So that's why I'm not a counselor to my friends, because um I can't be objective because I care for them, right? And I have emotional feelings about the situation. And part of that is realizing for myself that, yeah, I have thoughts outside of how I have my own thoughts and feelings about this because I might be angry that someone is treating them that way, or they're draining you. So that's the other part. And I think as friends or as people we have relationship with, those lines of when you need to go outside to that outside person for professional help or for more direct help for the particular problem is when um, that person is sharing more that really is appropriate to share in a friendship relationship. So going back to that reciprocity that we kind of talked about last time, of friendship is loving and caring and encouraging for each other, but we cannot fix each other's problems.
Right.
And so it's when other people's problems start becoming, something that we just can't leave at the altar of prayer, or we feel as though we are ill-equipped to help them, or they're expecting us to help them in a certain way and we can't.
Mhm.
And that's one reason why professional or spiritual helpers are so important, because bearing each other's burdens is not fixing that person's problem. It is carrying it, it's praying for them, it's encouraging them, but the person has to have someone outside of that circle who's not emotionally invested.
I think
Because
that's the key.
yeah, when we're emotionally invested, then our own thoughts and feelings get muddied. I mean,
Mhm.
that's for myself as a therapist. That's when I realize with people outside of my professional world, when I need to say, I can't, I'm not the person to really walk with you in that particular way through this, because I have my own emotions about it that really is not helpful to that person.
Mhm. So where do we find safe places? We talked about that a little bit, of finding safe spaces. And you mentioned closed environments. And I want to bring something up that we want to invite all of our listeners into is we have a closed environment on Facebook, a Facebook group that we will link to in the show notes, where it's a safe space to talk and be real with each other. It's not a counseling group, but a friendship encouragement group where we are all in this season of midlife momming together, where we can just be real of, hey, this is going on. Oh, it's a place to be like, I'm not alone. Oh, me too. Oh, you too. Me too. And to walk with and encourage each other and maybe offer a little bit of help of, oh, I've been there. I made it through. You will too. So Brenda, this is a fantastic group that you actually started years ago to go with your book Fledge. Can you tell us a little bit about that space and what's already there and the expansion that's kind of happening?
Sure. So I'm excited. It was called the Fledge Parent Forum, and really was around parenting, but also around the fledging season, which talks about all of these different topics that we are talking about here weekly. Um, so it's a space where we have weekly prayer. So that's one thing that has been consistent over the several years. And Amelia, you'll be joining us there weekly to pray for women. And it's also just a space where during this time that feels vulnerable. So I think midlife just feels vulnerable because so many things are changing, where we can talk about topics and even related to parenting. There's a whole library there of teaching videos that I've done around the parenting topics of Fledge, but also for self-care and just encouraging each other. So that's really what we're committed to. We're really committed to some of the acronym that you shared last time of HELP, which
Mm-hmm.
is honesty and encouragement, love, and prayer. So that's what that community is for. And so we would love for you to join us there to engage a little bit more conversationally outside of the podcast. But Amelia, we are inundated with two types of spaces. So we have real in-person spaces and we have online spaces. And what have you found are the kind of the parameters around finding safe spaces to share both in person or online?
I think that's the key to, you can find safe places online to be real. Something like a group that we have on Facebook where you are centered around a topic. And I have friends that I have not met in person yet, but we have been chatting and trading messages and encouraging each other and helping each other online for years. And we look forward to the day that we get to meet in person. And I have one friend that I met on vacation. We swung through her town. We were driving down the East Coast and swung through her town. It was the first we'd met in person and just connected over coffee for an hour. So again, it's just that testing the waters, so finding commonalities. So closed spaces online where you are centered around a topic like this. I found a few of those in some writing and speaking spaces, and the Midlife Mom forum page. We'd love to have you join there. And then there is something about that privacy. So I have found it in a small group at church, where at our church we have a covenant that we all agree to when we start each year with the group. And it's something that we all read together and we agree, this is a safe place. It's a no judgment zone. We sign it, which might sound kind of weird, but we can come back to that throughout the year to say, hey, I think we've strayed from this. Let's remember what's said in the circle stays in the circle, and a place where we can help each other and point out, hey, I think it might be time for some counseling or a mentor. And so that has been a big one for me, is being involved in a small group at church over the years. And some of my closest friends have come from that. It's a closed environment with a set of kind of guidelines. And it's something to try out too, because in many churches, and this is the case with mine, you're together for maybe it's a 6 or 8 week study. That's a great way to kind of test short term. Do I click with this group? Do we get along? And there might be some friendships that are formed in there that go deeper outside of the circle. And then sometimes you're like, no, this group wasn't for me. That's okay. I learned a lot, and try the next one. So I have found that to be a really great way of meeting friends, of trying small groups at church for 6, 8 weeks, or maybe it's for a school year. And then next year, maybe you're in a different group. Or I was in a group last summer. We were just a summer group, and we all clicked and connected. And so we continued on during the school year.
And I think too, as I was listening to that, there may be a lot of people listening whose churches don't have small groups or don't have women's Bible studies, or because of the pandemic, they're not meeting in person. And I was just thinking back to something that happened recently where I was vulnerable in asking for prayer for a very particular reason. And I reached out to, I think, 4 people. I think my dog is barking right now. If that is here in the background, he's done. He's heard me talking, and I haven't interacted with him yet today. But I have had to think through my life. We have different friendships in our lives, all of us do, that meet different needs. And so I have very close friends in the professional world, and then close friends in the personal world, and very few friends who I would really feel very safe being vulnerable with about things, in particular with my children, with my family, my children, my marriage. And there was an incident, or not an incident, but there was a situation in the last several weeks where I was very vulnerable as a mom with just a very select group of, I think it was probably 4 people who I just asked a very specific need. Please pray this way for me this weekend, because as a mom, I need to not be counselor. I need to not be the fixer. I just need to be mom. And I didn't want to share about the situation. It was private to all of us. But it felt so important for me to have those safe people who I could be very specific about a prayer without having to explain the situation, and that be safe, knowing that they weren't going to ask any more questions, knowing that they weren't going to judge me or anyone in my family, and that they truly were going to pray. And so I think that just even understanding who the people are in our life and what the different roles are also
Right.
play into that vulnerability.
And you have mentioned things too about going deep rather than wide. And this might be a season where you don't have a large group of friends, but you have a few that you go deep with. And I have been in seasons where I have gone to someone and asked, will you walk with me for a season? And several years ago, went to a woman that I had known from church. We don't live in the same state anymore. And I called her up and said, hey, would you mentor me about a particular topic? And maybe we just chat, on the phone for 6 months or so. And that was vulnerable, putting myself out there. And she graciously responded, and we did. It was just for, 6 months, 6, 7, 8 months. We would talk once a month for, half hour or so, but it was around a particular topic for a season. And those spaces are sometimes needed for what you're going through.
I would agree 100%. And I've done something similar. I started a group a few years ago just for women in my area who were involved in some type of ministry, because I had ministry friends several hours away or through social media, but not who physically lived in my area. And that has been a group that's been encouraging over the last couple of years. So I think we're kind of finishing up our time.
Yeah.
One resource that I did want to mention on vulnerability is Brene Brown. She is a well-renowned speaker and writer and professional in the kind of in the counseling mental health community, but she really speaks a lot on vulnerability. So we will put some of her resources in the show notes also. But Amelia, what is probably one of our biggest takeaways to encourage our listeners?
I think the action step I would say is to first start, are you willing to be vulnerable? Really evaluate. Do you have walls up? Are you willing to be vulnerable and take that step? And if not, start, like Brenda said, with being vulnerable with God. And the book of Psalms is a great place to start. There are numerous Psalms that can even model for you how to be vulnerable. Off the top of my head, I think of like Psalm 10 or Psalm 77, where the author is being very real with God in a lament, which is kind of saying, you know, things aren't okay and we need to talk about it, and starting there. So I would say just evaluate your life. Are you vulnerable, willing to be vulnerable, and be vulnerable with God first, and then maybe take that next step of who can you start to be vulnerable with.
And I do want to say that if there aren't people in your life who really are safe for you, then that next step really is seeking out professional services through a professional counselor, through the resources within your church. And I do just also want to say that vulnerability can be multi-layered. And if you have had experience of when you've been vulnerable and that's been betrayed, like for some people, church may not be the safe space for them, because they've had maybe some vulnerabilities that have been exposed or have been felt judged or shamed. But then also similar with counseling is that some people have been through counseling at a different time in their life, and they feel like it wasn't helpful or something like that. Not all counselors are the same. Not all church resources are the same. So I just want to encourage everyone that taking that first step really is admitting a need that you have, and then really look at the resources around you. And professional help may just be for a season. Sometimes counseling is just really truly for one particular item, and it may only be, a couple of months, or even just a few sessions until you kind of get equipped with those tools that you need, and then you're able to better then take that into your real life and share a little bit more about what you've been learning with friends and family. So just don't sit and feel as though you are all alone. I think that's one of the biggest things was when I was a struggling mom and was so afraid of judgment and really felt isolated. I needed someone who could hear my mess, enter into my mess, not to fix me, but just to say, you're going to be okay. I hear you. I see your struggle, and let me walk beside you. Um, and so I think that there's so much openness today in today's culture that we're at a different place than we were then. So I think even just having conversations, there are conversations like that are happening more and more, which is positive.
I think that is a great way to end this episode. Thank you all for joining us. We love you. You're not alone. We hope you will join us online in our Facebook group. We'll link to that in the show notes, but know that you're loved and you're cared for. Thanks so much for joining us. We will see you next week.
Bye. And Benny says goodbye too, if you can hear him barking.
That's awesome.